If you would, if you have your Bible, turn to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17. When I think of different stories in the Bible, different ones that have captured my imagination and what it would have been like to be there, there's so many different stories we could look at. You think about Noah, you think about the burning bush with Moses, you think about all those different amazing things that had taken place. And naturally, I start thinking about 1 Samuel 17. I start thinking about David and Goliath. We had a lesson not too long ago on David and Goliath. And it's just one that just has captured my imagination of thinking, man, I mean, the odds. I mean, there's no way this should have taken place. I think of different times football teams have played other football teams. Some, there's a lot less talent, but somehow that less talented team is able to be a team and they end up beating the higher ranked or the more talented team. And when you see that, you're just like, man. I mean, and those games, I've seen some of those games, they have them recorded, and I know who wins. I still want to watch. You know, it's kind of like, I know this is not a real movie. It's a real movie, I should say, but it's not real life. But man, Rocky. I mean, when I see Rocky, I want to see the end. I want to see Rocky take out whoever it is, whether it be the Russian or, you know, the punk that's on the street that killed his trainer, whoever it is, I want to see it. And man, he shouldn't have won, and he won, you know, all those kind of things. We love those kind of stories where it just seems like there's no way it could happen. You know, there's some neat stories about the Mighty 12, about a group of orphans in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that it was a foster home, and they were kids that were not adopted, and they went up against all these other teams, and they would win time after time. They had a book about it. There was NPR did a series about it. There was a movie about it, and it's neat. It was before World War II took place, and then all those men were drafted, and so then it phased out. But during this period of time, they shouldn't have been beaten, or they shouldn't have won anything, but they should have continued to be beaten, but they didn't. They were undefeated. They were a great team several different years in a row. And I look at those when the odds are stacked against you. And I look at this and I'm thinking, man, the odds are stacked against you. It just depends where you're looking. And I know a lot of times we look at this outside. And 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 on says, don't focus on the outside. All these things that waste away. And sometimes that's what we focus on. You know, maybe in a personal reason why I like this story is because, you know, it talks about when he's chosen, when he's anointed, it talks about how God doesn't look at the outside, the height of the man. And I'm so thankful. He doesn't look at the height of a man, but he looks at the inward character. That's what he's looking at. And so I see David and all the things that were looked at. And so just to kind of rehash this story, if you're not familiar with it, we have a young man that goes to see his brothers. His dad says, go check on them. And there's two battle lines that are drawn out, the Philistines and the Israelites. And so you have this big giant over 9 feet tall, and he comes out and he is wreaking havoc by threatening them, saying, hey, you bring out your best one. You bring out your best one, and we'll go toe-to-toe. And whoever wins, the other team, the team that wins is going to be dominant over the other team, or country, I should say, and we'll take them over. And we don't have to fight and have a whole lot die. It could just be me talking about Goliath and whoever else you choose. And so it's day after day this keeps happening. And nobody wants to take the offer. And it keeps going until the young man David shows up. And he's looking around thinking, this is crazy. What is everybody... Why are we sitting there focusing on this? This guy, he's saying something he shouldn't say. He's defying our God. He's defying, his people. No, we cannot have anybody defy the living God. I'll go if no one's going to go. And so, as we know, he goes. And he defeats this giant. And so, I want to take a look at some of the things that we see from your outline here. About what controls or what compels us, what motivates us, what stirs us, what gets us going. And sometimes, I know that 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14 talks about Christ's love compels, controls, motivates us. That's what it ought to be. And you see that relationship with David, that's what's motivated him. But if you look here in chapter 17, looking at 4 and following, we see a picture of this man. It says he was their champion from Gath, named Goliath. It says, from my version, it says his height was 6 cubits. So roughly they say it's over 9 feet. Some say maybe it's 9'6". And so tall, very tall, about 3 or 4 of me. And so then it talks about in verse 5, it says his helmet of bronze on his head, and he had an armed coat of mail, says his armor. And it says the coat of armor that he had, this coat of mail, it was 5,000 shekels, which means it's roughly 125 pounds. So you can imagine if he's carrying 125 pounds around, you know this man's got to be strong because he's got to be agile and be able to move with this 125 pounds. So if I got a barbell, that's 45 pounds, the ones we have at the high school. That's 45 pounds. And I just was going to have that, or just say I get a 45 pounds and strap it on my back and make it secure. It's not going to take very long. I'm not going to be walking very fast at all. And I'm going to be hunched over and I'm going to just be worn out. This is 125 pounds. Amazing. And then it keeps going. Then in verse 6 it says, his bronze armor on his legs, so it's more weight. And it says his javelin of a bronze slung between his shoulders. And it says in verse 7, the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And the spearhead, not the beam, but the spearhead at the tip, it says it weighed 600 shekels or 15 pounds. So can you imagine having a long stick on the end putting 15 pounds? I mean, what would happen to the stick for me? It just goes straight down. And I'd pick it up with the other hand and it goes straight down. There's no way I could get that. And then think about, it's got to balance it out so you can throw it or you can use it to fight. This thing would have been heavy. And he's sitting there and he can wheel this thing around. Me, it would just be a detriment. And so looking at him, mighty man, a lot of strength going on. And so at this time, he goes in and he says, I defy, in verse 10, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And so you see what controls and what compels, what motivates him. You see kind of where he's looking. So what does for him would be force. It's all about force for him. He's one of those guys, it's going to be might makes right. And so if he can push somebody around, he's going to push them around. And so that's what he's going to be using. Matter of fact, it goes on and he comes out. It says in verse 41, the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. So he's got another guy in front of him holding his shield, all these different things. This guy, this is all he knows is force. And there's some people that's all they know is force. They push people around, and it may not be physically, but they think their statue, what elevation they have in rank of some business, or if they're the owner, they think they can push people around. And that's force. They look at what controls and motivates them as force. Well, then you look in verse 25. Verse 25, it says, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him and give great riches and give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So, you talk about no taxes. This is a great situation. You're going to get money. Your family's not going to be burdened down with the king's edicts and those type of things. And you get the king's daughter. This is a great setup here. And so you can see what Saul looks at, what motivates, what compels him. What motivates and compels and controls him is flesh. It's the things that he can put his hands on. Because if I get enough money, that's going to solve my problems. We know people like that, don't we? That if I throw money at it, it's going to solve it. I always have said the world's problems are solved with money. Because that's what they're focused on. That's what their control is. Anytime you get an argument, or I've had an argument where somebody is worried about something, it's usually about money. And when I'm in school, I've had, I don't know how many conversations about people, well, I don't have the money in the budget, and they complain about this and that. And then I just kind of remove it. I said, no, we don't. But how about I just take care of it? And we'll say, well, what do you mean? Well, how about I just buy it for you? And then I'll say, oh, well, I'm not saying. Well, that's the problem. You're complaining about money. The solution's there. They just want to complain. But there's solutions solved with money, and then they don't have anything to complain about. There's this one lady, and she was in charge of a certain program, a certain area, and she was complaining that she couldn't do her job without this. And so our budget was pretty tight, and we didn't really have the money. And so I just went out and bought it and gave it to her and didn't say anything and just laid it there in her office and or her desk where she was at, and just left her in a conference period. And she comes in, she sees it. Oh, man, she's elated. Her problem's solved. Because she couldn't see any other thing past but the things that you touch. That's what solves things. And money, sadly, solves it. That's what solves things. All these riches, it's going to solve the problem. I'll throw everything at it. You can have my daughter. I give you my daughter. I'll make it to where your father's house is free, have all these riches. I'll take care of it. I'm going to spend all the money, and that'll solve the problem. Too many people, that's what controls and motivates and controls them. The flesh. And then you see the brothers. If you look in verse 24, it said, all the men of Israel, they saw the man, and they fled from him and were much afraid. They start asking, and the men of Israel says, that's the verse we read, that king will give all these things if you go and take care of this giant. And so when this happens, in verse 28, you see the brothers here. The eldest brother, he heard when he spoke to the men, and his anger burned against David. He comes up to David and he says, why have you come down? And this is verse 28, and with whom have you left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the heart and the evil of your heart, and you've come down to see the battle. So he's being accused of something he didn't. You're just wanting to see this whole thing take place. This is just a big game for you. This is some entertainment for you. And so, man, we're really worried about this. After all, in verse 24, when he would come out, all the Israelites, they would flee, including the brothers. And so what controls or compels or motivates them is fear. That's what controls them. They're so afraid. And when you're afraid, you usually take that out in a harsh way to somebody else. And so he's afraid, the eldest brother in verse 28. And so he takes it out on his brother, like, why are you here? But he was scared to death. He didn't want to go out there. He was hiding like the rest of them. And so too often, fear compels us. Fear ends up being the thing that controls us. We don't have the opportunity. We have an opportunity, but we don't have the courage to go and talk to someone about Jesus. Or we don't have the courage to go ahead and not participate with someone else. Or when someone's talking in a way they shouldn't, for us just to get in the way and just avoiding that situation. We don't have the courage. Sometimes we have that fear. And so that's sometimes what controls and compels us. And then you see David. And man, David's just totally different. He's not controlled or compelled by force. He's not controlled and compelled by the flesh. He's not controlled and compelled by fear. You see, he has a different controlling force in his life. If you look in verse 37, he's talking to Saul, and Saul's saying, well, here, put all these things on. And he's like, man, I don't need all this stuff. He says, I don't think you really understand who I am. He says in verse 36, we'll read that one. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. For he's defiled the armies of the living God. He's gone up against God. And we know from Romans chapter 8, verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? Well, he's answering the question, it doesn't matter who's against us. Because God's going to win in the end. He always wins in the end. That's the spoiler for the rest of the world. He's always going to win. And so in verse 37, he says, and David said, the Lord who delivered me. Notice, when he said he struck down in verse 36, lions and bears, he qualifies that by saying, the Lord delivered me. That's who gave me the victory. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. He knows what controls and compels him. The whole way through, he's asking, why is someone going to be talking against the Lord's army this way? Why is someone going to be talking against God this way? Don't they know who God is? Don't they recognize His power, His strength, His might? And so what controls and compels him is faith. That's all that controls him. He knows who's going to win in the end. It's not going to be him. He's just an instrument for God. That God's going to be the one that wins. And so when you look at that and you look at our life and we start seeing what's been controlling us this week. You look at just this week, not talking about this year or the previous years or all the way down, but just look at this past week. Out of those four things, what's controlled you? Have you just kind of pushed things forward? I'm just going to take care of myself. I'll just do it. Or has it been, man, I'm just going to throw money at the situation. I'll take care of things that way. Or is it fear? Just the fact that, man, and that just enables you to not have any movement. A lot of times fear causes us just to be still. It's that freeze, flight, or fight. And sometimes we freeze when there's fear. Or is it faith that's been compelling us? Is that what has been controlling us every day through the obstacles that we face? And I know we're facing a lot of different things individually and with our families. We have a lot of things going on. And so what's controlling us? What's compelling? What's motivating us? And then the next question is, where did they look for help? And so when they looked for help, it's a little bit different. So when you look for help, in verse 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, and Saul and all the Israelites heard the words of the Philistine. The ones where he says, I defy the ranks this day. Give me a man and we'll fight together. He says, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly frightened. And so, look down at verse 25. This we read earlier. The king is willing to give riches, his daughter, and make the man's father's house free in Israel who goes and fights. And so you can see these brothers here, when it says they were dismayed and frightened, because it says Saul and all Israel. So it's talking about these brothers here. And that's what we're going to be focusing on, these brothers. What they were looking at. These brothers, they're looking at, well, you could get rich here. You could do those things. And, Saul, he's going to give you all this stuff. Plus, we're running and hiding. We're dismayed. We're frightened. Who's to help? They were looking around for someone to help. That was a problem. So they were looking outward. Because all of them are saying, they all know that there's riches that can be gained. But none of those people are saying, yeah, I'll take them. I'll take it. And then nobody's raising their hand. They're all saying, hey, Edward, they got some riches. Why don't you go do it? Oh, no, I'm busy. I can't do that. Gil, why don't you go ahead and take care of it? And so they want someone else to do it, but not them. And so they're looking around. And so all these men, all these brothers are looking around for everyone else to help. You could look at the brothers of David or the brothers as far as all the Israelites. And then the people, what they were looking for help, you see Saul in verse 25. He's looking at his wealth. He's looking inward. And so while you have outward, the brothers are looking outward to see, hey, is anybody going to do this? You have Saul and he's looking inward and saying, what else can I give? That someone would step up and do something. And oftentimes, we're looking around for someone else to do the work. We're looking about and seeing if we have any courage within us. But then all of a sudden, point number 3 under where did they look for help, you see David. And David in verse 47 kind of answers a question. And he says, and I'll go up in verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver it into my hand, and I will strike you down. He's talking to Goliath, and cut off your head. And I'll give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And so he's looking upward. And so you see that the whole time you have everybody looking at different places, and he's the only one looking in the right direction. He's looking upward because of what he's motivated and compelled with, controlled by faith. And so you see these brothers, and you see Saul, they're looking outward and inward. They're looking, can anyone do anything? I can't do it. You guys can't do it. But David's looking up. And then you look at the next question. Where should we be looking? And so, if you would, go to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. Because I think sometimes it's easy to look at a story from the Old Testament and you say, man, those were miraculous days and the things that God did when He intervened to make sure that lineage of Jesus came through to where Jesus could be born from the tribe of Judah, all these different things. You know, He had His hand on everything. And it just doesn't work like that today. And so sometimes we just have a problem of where we're looking and what we're motivated with. And instead of being compelled by faith, instead of looking upward, you know, there's different things that we do. We look at other people, maybe what they should be doing, and question, well, I can't do this, but you should. Well, there's 3 different directions we ought to be looking that are similar to the first one. And found in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, it says, therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, well, we need to look outward. That's what we need to do. And the motivating factor is, it says, since we're surrounded by such a great a cloud of witnesses. Those witnesses are found in chapter 11. These witnesses, like Abel in verse 4, like Enoch in verse 5, like Noah in verse 7, like Abraham in verse 8, like Sarah in verse 11, like Isaac in verse 20, Jacob in 21, Joseph in verse 22, Moses in verses 23. We look at all these different people. Rahab in verse 31. And it goes on and it says, you know, I don't have time to tell you about all the others in verse 32. All these different ones that did these things. And he's talking about this group of people that lived by faith. And they died by faith. He's saying since we've been surrounded by that cloud of witnesses, that ought to be the motivating factor for us. Because one of those people in verse 32, it mentions David. That ought to be a motivating factor since we're surrounded by those type of people. We get to see that in the scriptures. That should encourage us to look outward to those people to get encouragement. As it talks about in chapter 10 of Hebrews, it mentions in verse 24, it says, let us consider how to spur one another or stir up one another to love and good works. We should be surrounded by a group of people that should help us and spur us. So you should be helping me and I should be helping you. And as I read these passages, these people that lived and died by faith, that should encourage me. And as we goes on, it talks about in verse 25 of Hebrews chapter 10, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. And so it's about spending time to encourage, to sharpen each other's sword. That's where I should be looking. I should be looking to you. You should be looking to me. Because that's where we're going to get strength. That's where we're going to get encouragement, to stir each other up, to spur each other on, to love and good works. And so not just looking outward to get encouragement, but point number 2 of this question is we need to look inward. And inward, there and back of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, it says, therefore, since we've been surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, it goes on and it says, let us also lay aside every weight. So not just get encouragement from the people around you, but then it says lay every weight and sin that clings so closely. And let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. We know those certain things in our life that are holding us back. It's just like if I had weights, if I had 5-pound weights on my ankles, I can walk. It's not an issue. I can walk to my house and back. I wouldn't be out of breath, I don't think. I think I could pull that off. But now if I do that all day long, I'm going to be worn out. And if you want me to run, there's no way I can run. Because it's going to weigh me down and it's not going to be very long. I'd say less than a quarter of a mile. I'm already thinking, all right, whose idea was this? I'm already getting worn out. Here it says, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. We know the sin in our life that keeps us back. We know the relationships in our life that hold us back. We know the different situations and surroundings that we put ourselves in that help us and those that harm us. And it says those things that harm you, put those things aside, lay those aside. it says, it mentions everything. It says, lay aside every weight and sin. So everything that's causing you to not be your best self, to not be best at following, to not be the best Christian, that's what we should be doing. And so then it's not just about laying that stuff aside. It's about getting busy. It says to run. And it says to run with endurance. That means it's going to be difficult and it's going to be tiring. And you need to look inward and say, man, I need to start doing this. The only way you build strength is by continuing on. The only way you build endurance is by continuing on. He's talking about you just continue on. So we need to look outward so we can get encouragement when we struggle, because we're going to struggle. We need to look inward, those things that are causing us to not be the Christians we ought to be. I might be right here, but I could be a lot better if I laid some things aside. Things that I may cherish, I need to put those aside and focus on Him. And then the last point is we need to look upward. Because it says, after you have laid everything aside, every weight, every sin, and then you start running the race that's before you. And everybody's got a race. It's called life, and everybody's got to do it. We have our own race to run. I can't run yours. You can't run mine. It says how we do this. Every race that I've ever been in, at some point, you're getting close to that finish line. If it's a straight line, you see the finish line in sight the whole way. But it's a curve, sometimes you kind of lose sight of that finish line. And I think, when I was running a 400, it's coming, and you only have 2 curves and 2 straights. And so you're counting down, hopefully it gets over soon. As you're going through that first curve, okay, just one more curve. I got one more straight here after this, and you're counting these things down in your mind. The end is in sight, but you don't see the finish. Sometimes we can't see the finish line because we don't know when we're going to pass on to this life to the next. And and I say sometimes, none of us know. And sometimes we get bogged down in the day-to-day things, and that accumulates in our day, and we don't lay those things aside and focus on the race because we get lost and we can't see the finish line. Here it tells us how to see the finish line. In verse 2, it says, look into Jesus. It says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. His race is finished. That's why He's sitting down. He's done. He's completed His race, so He's able to sit. We can't sit. It tells us we got to run. We got to run till we get to that finish line. The only way we can get to that finish line is by focusing on the finish line. And who's at that finish line? It's the one that's sitting down. It's Jesus. We focus on Him. That's how we run the race. That's when it gets difficult, when it gets tiring. It says you focus upward. You focus on Him. That's how we finish. There's no doubt David was focusing on the Lord. There's no doubt. He said, the Lord my God, He's going to take this. It's His battle. I'm just going to be the instrument that He's going to use to win this battle. That's the way it ought to be for us. He's already won this battle. It ought to be up to us to say, I'm going to be His instrument of righteousness, as it talks about in Romans. I'm going to be His instrument of righteousness to carry out His mission for good, to help those people that are struggling, that don't have hope, those people that haven't had good news, those people that don't know what it's like to have their sins washed away. I need to be that person. But the only way I do it is to make sure I'm encouraging you and you're encouraging me. And I'm making sure that everything that I have in my life that's hindering me from running the race, that I lay that aside and don't pick it up when it's convenient. I just keep it there. And I never look back, and I keep looking forward to Jesus, the author and finisher. And so He finished, and He can help us finish. So if you have prayers you want us to be praying about, let us know. We can be praying for you. Not so we can keep you hostage on, man, you said you were going to stop doing that, but for us to encourage you, to uplift you, hold you accountable when it gets to be a struggle. And if you haven't put Christ on and you don't know what it's like to become a Christian, become a child of God, then let's study about that. And if you know someone that would like to study and they're not here, then get with me and I'll study with them at any time. But whatever we can do for you, please come while we stand and sing.